Skirball Museum, please note that change. So those are my announcements. It's being recorded, the change in the schedule, and with that I will turn it over to Steve, who this is his first Olli presentation, so be kind and welcoming, give him an Olli welcome. Yes, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Steve. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Well, first, thanks to the many supporters of this research effort. Thank you to Martin, Pam, Jack, Susie, Dr. Will Sawyer at the Glendale Historic Preservation. I'd like to thank Christ Church, the broader Glendale community that supports the preservation of its unique history. Thank you to the research assistants at Cincinnati and Hamilton County Library and Jenny Harden, librarian at the Mary Schiff Reference Library that's right next to the Art Museum that you can actually access from the Art Museum on the 3rd floor. Thank you to the Frick Archives of American Collectors in New York, and a special thank you to Dr. Peter Bell, the curator of European art at the museum. I'd also like to thank my wife for her ongoing encouragement every day, which I can summarize in 9 words. Please get out of the house and do something. How did I get interested in the history of Cincinnati's great female art collectors? I started out at art museums looking at the placards that you see, next to a painting. It'll say what the artist is or who the artist is, possibly the topic or the name, perhaps what year it was painted, what year the artist lived, what his nationality might be. They vary depending on the museum, but just about every library or every gallery, if you look at the bottom, you'll see a number and then a description. And that's called the accession number. It's the agreement, the assent, the condition of acceptance of this piece of art into the museum. If we were going to look at Mary's collection, it was all given in 1967. So we would have that first numbers would be 1967, and then it would be followed by several other numbers, which are just for the museum as the catalog when this came in. Over time, I learned that there were 4 great women collectors in Cincinnati between 1900 and 1950. It's a quartet. These are the members of that quartet. It starts with Anna Sinton Taft, Mary Emery, Mary Hannah, and who we're going to talk about today, Mary E. Johnston. Now, while everything in this lecture can be footnoted, I've not been shy about taking some literary, poetic, chronological, photographic, and other licenses in telling Mary's and her peers' story today. All references to dollars have been translated into today's dollars. So this is how much a piece of art would sell for today. It would be how much a piece of art would be purchased for today. Now, the way I'm going to try to tell this story today, in Act 1, we'll kind of get a feel for the macro environment in which these women lived. They collected 1900 to 1950. So about 70 to 120 years ago. Then I'm going to provide a snapshot of each of these 3 women and then do a deep dive into Mary. Act 2, we'll jump into Mary leaving Cincinnati and going to high school in Washington, D.C. We'll also follow her for a few years after she leaves high school. So she'd be in her late teens, 20s. Act 3, we'll jump ahead. Mary will now be in her 50s. It's the 1940s. She's collecting modern European art, principally in the U.S., during that period of time. In a epilogue, we'll explore what are some of her other philanthropies as well, because all of these women were much more than mere art collectors. So let's begin with women's rights. And all of these collectors lived in a portion of the Gilded Age in a Western progressive city that nonetheless accorded women a different level of civil rights, certainly than we have come to think of today. Cincinnati at that time, by its cultures, by its practices, laws, traditions, effectively relegated these women to perhaps second-class citizenship. Each of these women was denied the right to vote during a portion of their lives. They all had limited rights to divorce, but were expected to marry and marry a man. They were expected to have children, but had limited access to birth control. And of course, all children were expected to be born within wedlock. College at that time was a man's game. None of the women were encouraged to attend the country's great universities and had limited options to what we think of as higher education today. Harvard was nominally co-ed in 1963. That's the year that technically Radcliffe women would also get on their degree. Harvard University, Yale wouldn't go co-ed until 1969, and Princeton wouldn't go co-ed until Yale was ahead of that, 1968, Princeton, 1969. Now, to get a feel for what, when those topics would come up of co-educating the Ivy Leagues, here's what a few Princeton alums had to say. If Princeton goes co-educational, my alma mater will be dead to me. It will no longer exist. Another, much worse. I would rather Princeton spend the money on a good old-fashioned whorehouse. It would be cheaper, more efficient, and yield a more desirable product. So, different than today. I'm going to jump through that. Their wealth did not put them into the upper 1%. Rather, it put them into the upper 10th of that 1%. Their wealth all came from earlier generations. They were the sons and daughters of Cincinnati's Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Morgans. But I like to think Cincinnati lacked some of the social drama that accompanied New York's Gilded Age and encouraged inflated egos to compete in building buildings that were almost homes or hotels that were almost temples to oneself. John Jacob Astor's mansion on Fifth Avenue, the Vanderbilt estate in North Carolina. Like many of the 1%, they became wealthy by just showing up. Jeff Bezos' kids, they didn't earn the money that's gonna go to them. Now his wife might have, they got divorced him after he had an affair. I don't think Alice Walton really worked ever at a Walmart store. She's worth $66 billion. I know Jackie Mars never worked in a candy factory. She's worth a mere $39 billion. None of the generation of art collectors or their husbands that we will talk today made it on their own. This art came from old money. Some of their money at that time came from war profiteering, but a lot did not. The Civil War era, and economic boom time immediately afterwards, however, accounted for a disproportional amount of their generational wealth. This is John Jacob Astor's son's mansion. It was torn down in 1893 to make way for something even grander. We'll visit that in a few slides. Okay, on. Oh, I have no idea how that got in there. My apologies. This was not meant to be political at all. All four substantially influenced the architecture, the boards, the executive leadership, the funding, and the collections of Cincinnati's great arts institutions. But I think it's important to note that they had similar influence over the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, the University of Cincinnati, the May Festival, and Cincinnati Children's Hospital, along with other great institutions in Cincinnati. Most of these women were rather reserved and camera shy. They preferred the anonymity of doing good works rather than taking credit for them. This is the first we'll talk about in this quartet, Anna Sinton Taft. Anna's taste in art was shaped during a grand tour of Europe with her father, David Sinton Taft, when she was about 18 in the 1870s. Anna at the age of about 50, and her husband, Charles Taft, would travel in the 1900s to Europe to begin building an art collection on a grand scale. They could well afford to. Anna was the only surviving child of David Sinton and inherited his entire estate. The amount? $700 million. It made her not only the richest woman in Cincinnati, the richest woman in Ohio, but one of the richest women in the United States. It wasn't all Taft money that bought there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Beginning in 1903, the Tafts made their collection available for viewing to prominent members of the prominent members. Just trying to.
Come here, try it.
Okay. That's David Sinton. They made their collection available for viewing at their house privately on select Sunday afternoons. People were invited to tea there. Mary Emery, Mary Hannah, Mary Johnston, all would have received invitations to admire the Taft's growing collection of Flemish painters, Rembrandt, Frans Hals, Jing Dynasty, ceramics, and a smaller collection of American masters, including Cincinnati's Frank Duvenix. This is Cobbler's Apprentice. They'd also hear stories about art and perhaps how the art was acquired. I've always wondered if there was some competitiveness between the Taft's Museum and the Cincinnati Art Museum. And I can tell you at that time, there was not. Charles Taft was instrumental in convincing civic leaders that the city needed an art museum and an art academy. He believed every artisan should have the opportunity to derive inspiration from the best works within their field, that they needed the ability to study these works up close and in person. The next of the quartet is Mary Emery. Mary Emery studied in Brooklyn at the creatively and originally named Brooklyn Female Academy, where she gained notoriety as a math and astronomy whiz. She was the girl that would win the math contest year in and year out. I imagine this is Mary up there banging out some equations on the blackboard. She was, I can only imagine, shocked when her mother sat her down and told her, after she had finished high school, honey, you know all those plans you've been making to come out and debut with all your friends in New York society after you graduate high school and live happily ever after in New York as a member of New York society? Well, Daddy's got this great idea to disrupt all those plans and move the family to a city called Cincinnati. 4 years after arriving in Cincinnati, Mary would wed Thomas Emery. Thomas J. was the oldest son of a businessman who had established the Emery Candle Company, which enjoyed exponential growth during the Civil War and afterwards. Together, the couple bought an estate out of town called Marymount, near Newport, Rhode Island. Mary did not, however, live happily ever after. Mary and her son would have 2 children. Sheldon, the oldest, would die at age 13 of disease. Albert, the youngest, would die only 4 years later at age 16 from a sledding accident. Mary then became widowed at the age of 52 in 1906, and some referred to her as the loneliest millionaires. In 1923, she funded the planned community of Marymount, Ohio, named after her estate in Rhode Island. She died a mere 4 years later in 1927. Bequeathing not only her collection of paintings of Van Dyck, George Romney, Velazquez, Rembrandt, Gainsborough, amongst others to the Cincinnati Art Museum, but financing a building to hold this collection. The Art Museum couldn't handle 35 masterpieces at the time.
The third member of the group is Mary Hannah. Mary was never married. She loved studying musical performance from an early age. In her youth, she was known as throwing an excellent party. Her Mardi Gras parties were famous. Her life would change in 1905 at the age of 45 when her father, Henry Hannah, died. Henry Hannah is not to be confused, especially by me, with the Cleveland political kingmaker, Senator Mark Hannah. Henry Hannah was like a regional Warren Buffett with vast and diverse commercial interests in banking, coal, iron, railroads, gas, electric, telephone, and real estate. He left behind an estate of about $150 million, give or take. Henry Hannah and David Sinton, you'll remember, was Anna Taft's father, were brother-in-laws. Both were said to have worked out of offices that were furnished no more luxuriously than the average automobile garage. In other words, they were not known as having extravagant offices, certainly compared to someone like J.P. Morgan in New York on Wall Street. Henry Hannah used to frequent the Cuvier Club, later the Cuvier Press Club, which is now located in the old Fleischheimer Mansion on 22 Garfield Place. In 2006, it served as the home of Cincinnati-based design firm LPK. There, he and fellow Irishman Pat Roach loved telling each other stories and jokes. Here's an example. Hannah: Pat, I heard that there are 100,000 Irishmen that are willing to take up arms today and fight for Irish independence. Roach: Well, Henry, why don't they? Hannah: Because, Patty, the police won't let them. After his passing, she became a prominent philanthropist and lived in a 10,000 square foot mansion in Hyde Park that her father began building her before he died in 1905. The house was big enough to serve as the movie set for the family home in the exquisitely directed film Carol. Now, Carol takes place in 1952, is set in New York, where there's a complicated sexual relationship that begins between a married woman in the throes of a divorce, played by Cate Blanchett, in the background, and a Manhattan shop girl, Rona Mara, in the foreground. Mary was publicity shy. In the summer of 1946, the president of CAM's board of directors announced Mary's Hannah, no strings attached, princely gift to CAM of 34 European paintings by masters such as Frans Hals, Rembrandt, Edgar Degas, Gainsborough, Renoir, J.M.W. Turner, Mary Cassatt, etc. She too would donate a wing to the CAM to house it. At the time of the announcement, she arranged to be out of town at one of her vacation homes. Now, most likely it would have been her home in Kennebunkport, Maine, rather than their Florida home, where it would have been too hot. There's a wonderful story of the director of the museum, Philip Adams, courteously attending to an elderly Mary Hannah during a visit to the museum in later years. Now, when Mary arrived, she was in a meeting and he caught up with Mary when, in a wheelchair, she was viewing one of her most expensive paintings. It had been absent from the museum walls for a number of months. Director Adams apologized that it had been gone so long and explained because of its tremendous value. It had recently gone through an extensive restoration and conservation process. Mary asked the director to bend down to her wheelchair so she could speak to him. Philip, I gave those paintings to you, to the museum, and to the citizens of Cincinnati. But frankly, I don't care what you do with them. Sell them for all I care. Thank you, Philip. Now I'm going to get on along with my tour with my aide. Generosity, no strings.
In my lecture today, we'll take a deep dive into the life of an accomplished female 20th century art collector, Mary E. Johnston. Different from Anna Taft, Mary Emery, and Mary Hanna, she would collect exclusively modern art and artists that were alive in her lifetime. Cézanne, Mondrian, Modigliani, Picasso, Chagall, Matisse, Braque, Van Gogh were all alive in her lifetime. She would, however, collect the art of the new. Where did she come from? What shaped her eye for art? How did she collect? And objectively, how well did she actually do as a 20th century modern art collector? Act 1, Scene 2, where did she come from? Glendale. Mary was born into peaceful, tranquil, bucolic, suburban Glendale in 1890. Glendale is arguably America's first planned suburb. Its lineage is about 70 years older than Marymount. It was a master planned community developed in 1850 from 500 acres of farmland by an investor group. In today's dollars, they offered 300 lots at a very reasonable price of $20,000 a lot. It was out of town. It was, this was out west. This was, the Westchesters almost of today. Its location, however, was very, very strategic, and importantly, being a stop for the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Hamilton, Richmond, Chicago, and Dayton railroads, both passenger on the right side of the tracks and freight on the less desirable side of the tracks. The community boasted a fine public school, a library and social center, and a women's college a mere 4 years after its founding. It too was creatively and originally named Glendale Female College. Its campus was described as surrounded by wholesome, industrialist, moral, Christian families. It went without saying, white. Mary was likely tutored by some of the college's instructors before she left Glendale for high school. The college would close in 1929. Now, Glendale's royalty is derived from the House of Proctor. It originated with King William I, or William Proctor, the founder with James Gamble of P&G in 1837. King William II, or William Alexander Proctor, was his father's successor at Procter & Gamble as the president, and would build a massive compound in Glendale on which he would build the Oaks. It was spread over 20 acres of land. His son, King William III, or William Cooper Proctor, would inherit the title of president of P&G from his father, and would add his own home on the family compound called the Woodlands. Okay, where does Mary Johnston fit in to this Proctor lineage and this royalty? Well, this is the story of the Titus sisters, Anne and Jane. They were mere commoners. Anna would marry middle management P&G soap salesman Alexander Johnston. They would have been upper middle class. They had a couple of children, Margaret, or Marty, and Mary. Mary's the subject of the talk today, or Miss Mary, as she would become known around Glendale and Cincinnati. And that's how this story might have ended. Mary and Marty growing up, middle class, as a kid in Glendale. But there was always a rainbow shining over them. That rainbow came from Jane's marriage to King William III, William Cooper Proctor. They would not have any children. So Mary and Margaret, over time, started growing up as normal kids, making normal friends, but had this rich fairy godmother and uncle to take the girls for a ride in the electric car, give them some outlandish presents. But they're like frogs in a pot of wealth. They kind of got indoctrinated and used to the heat going up and the largesse going up around them. Uncle, this is the original home where they would have lived. Uncle and Aunt Proctor would enthusiastically dote on their nieces, especially Mary, their entire lives. They almost treated the girls as their own children, and Mary was their favorite child. They showed them how to entertain guests with 10-course meals. I don't know if I've ever had a 6-course meal. They provided the girls with tennis lessons at the Glendale Lyceum. Each would become a club champion. Mary in singles, her sister Marty in doubles. They taught the girls bridge, which became a lifelong passion of Mary's. They provided the girls with French lessons. They exposed them to big city life. This is the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel. This replaced the mansion of William Astor that we saw earlier. When Mary would go to New York in the 1940s, this building had been taken down and replaced in 1931 with the Empire State Building. All in Mary's life. Hat shopping. They would go to about 5 hat shops. They'd take 5 hats back to the hotel, and they'd kind of conduct a fashion show for Uncle Proctor and their aunt, and take one of these hats back to Cincinnati. The price of these hats? Expensive. They're about $500 a piece. I can tell you, Colonel Proctor couldn't believe they were that expensive either. They provided the girls with riding lessons, and in 1909, the Proctors would build the Johnstons, the king and queen's brother-in-law, a new home, adjacent to the Proctor compound in Glendale, so aunt and uncle could be even closer to the girls. We've all heard of helicopter parents. These have been one of the first helicopter aunts and uncles. Now, I announced the role of Mary Johnston will be played by a young Lindsay Lohan in the next few slides. Mary had an unusual relationship with her Uncle Proctor. She was his favorite. Beginning in 1907, they would begin corresponding, writing letters back and forth for almost 30 years, exchanging hundreds of good-hearted notes. A portion of those are published. But it wasn't merely high society, international travel, sporting, or social graces that Uncle Proctor would teach Mary. He would teach Mary at a very early age that with great wealth and privilege came even greater responsibility. Both Mary and her uncle were devout Episcopalians. They likely would have been considered members of the social gospel movement of the time, during which rich white Anglo-Saxon Protestants applied Christian ethics to social problems, things like social justice issues, such as economic inequality, poverty, alcoholism, crime, racial tensions, slums, the environment, child labor, poor schools, and you won't believe what they were called back then. They were called Republicans. Social gospel sought in practice, to put in practice the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 16:6-10. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Mary and her uncle felt a personal calling to doing God's will on earth. They viewed themselves as God's servants. They continually challenged themselves to be useful to God while they were on earth, an earth that he had created for all men, rich and poor. This is the art that interested Mary in her teenage years. Domenico Ghirlandaio, an Italian Renaissance painter. How do we know of her interest in Ghirlandaio? Because as a teen, she presented a paper to the Glendale Art Club. So early on, she demonstrated a keen, deep interest in art and art appreciation. But in the next 30 years, that taste would change radically. Let's next explore how her taste changed and what might have impacted that change. I argue that three things changed that perception. One was her introduction to New York. This is right after high school. She's off to New York. She'd have classmates there after she graduated. She knew early how to navigate New York, how to navigate New York society, how to get an introduction letter to anyone. Contemporaneously, she'd have opportunities to experience any type of art: dramatic, dance, ballet, symphony, opera. She grew up attending those performances in Cincinnati under her tutelage of her aunt and uncle. Her mastery of French and her early travels to France, to Paris, where she would have exposure to even different social customs, likely going to jazz clubs. And I think you know what type of people went to jazz clubs. She'd be exposed to even more progressive art than in Paris. This was really cutting edge stuff when she got there in 1909, 1910, 1911. Because she had mastered French, she could go to the theater, she could go to the opera and hold her own in a conversation, in a cafe, or a bar. Finally, her high school education. Both formally studying the liberal arts in high school and socially mingling with a different Eastern crowd. She would see how these Eastern women lived and enjoyed life. During her life, she would remain very loyal, though, to the friends she grew up with. She'd always be in touch with them. They'd always travel together throughout her life. But after high school, she went exploring the world. Act 2, on to high school and exposure to life outside of Glendale. Let's talk about Mary's high school. Mary and her sister attended high school in Washington, D.C. Her timing was impeccable. She arrived during Theodore Roosevelt's final term was ending, and Cincinnati, Howard Taft's, was just beginning. Mary and Margaret went to the Episcopalian, new, and elite National Cathedral School. That's where LBJ's daughters went, Lucy and Linda. It's where Vice President Gore's daughters went. It's where Queen Noor of Jordan graduated. A school where President Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Ethel, was a classmate. We will contrast Ethel in a moment with her older sister, Alice, who some of you may know. Hearst Hall is the original building on campus. It was donated by the richest woman in the world at that time, Phoebe Apperson Hearst. Phoebe Hearst was a widow of the American miner, businessman, and politician George Hearst, who died fabulously wealthy as a U.S. senator. That's weird. Mark Hanna was a senator too, though we talked about being fabulously wealthy. Phoebe, however, might be better known, that's Senator Hearst, better known as the mother of William Randolph Hearst, played in this afternoon's performance by none other than the great Orson Welles. The value of a good art appreciation teacher is much more valuable than any museum director. because a museum director can be fired, and it's not very often that art appreciation teachers are. And therefore, there's oftentimes a generation that might be denied a foundation in art that would serve them their entire lives. I had a great art teacher. That's why I'm here, an art appreciation teacher. I'm not an artist. The director of fine arts at the National Cathedral School at that time was a legendary teacher, Lola Sleeth. She was an accomplished art theorist and practitioner, mastering oils, watercolors, sculptures in stone. Her best known work is a bust of Martha Washington, which is in the National Portrait Gallery. This bust was used as the model for Martha Washington's 4-cent stamp. Now, how might this education have influenced Mary? Her teacher, Lola Sleeth, studied at the prestigious Académie Julian in Paris, the same elite French art school at which Pierre Bonnard would study, at which Jean Arc would study, at which Henri Matisse would study, at which Paul Cézanne would study. All of these painters is represented in Mary's collection. Romanian Blouse by Matisse, Still Life by Cézanne, Landscape by Bonnard, and Wheel by Jean Arc. In DC, Mary was introduced to a much vaster cosmopolitan crowd. Her classmate, Ethel Roosevelt, was Teddy's younger daughter. She was perfectly normal, generous throughout her life. Her older sister, however, provides a little contrast of what life in the fast lane might have been like. Strikingly beautiful, Alice Roosevelt was a leading figure in DC in society. She dressed flamboyantly, she smoked, she rode horses astride, not English. She might have kissed men, enjoyed late night parties, openly expressed her opinions in politics. She wasn't afraid to tell her father that when she disagreed with him. He grumbled, "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I can't do both." Alice was the center of attention in the social context of her father's presidency. She thrived on attention. Her outspokenness and antics, however, won her the hearts of the American people. They nicknamed her Princess Alice. She was the Kim Kardashian, the Paris Hilton of that day. And Mary would have been feet away from this type of celebrity. After high school graduation, Mary would go to New York. This is where she'd stay, the Hotel Manhattan, the tallest hotel in the world at its time, right next to Grand Central Station. Being close to the trains was ever important. At the time, New York's hotels were newer, more deeply staffed, more modern, more spacious, more elegant than their European counterparts. I mean, look at the height of these rooms, how much space there is in the rooms, and look how ornate those ceilings are. Who might Mary hang out with in New York? Would she bump into her classmate? Mary's actual classmate, Brenda Putnam, who was a sculptor. Brenda became dissatisfied with New York's conventional academic sculpture and left early in her career to study in Paris, a place Mary would be going shortly. She wanted to study a more modern aesthetic. Brenda Putnam shared an apartment and studio with another female sculptress, Hyatt Harrington. Her sculpture of Joan of Arc on Riverside Drive and 93rd Street is New York's first monument dedicated to an historical woman. These would have been the type of people that Mary might have been running around with after she graduated high school and was in New York. Where else did she spend time in New York, especially in the summer when it got hot? I hate New York in July. Just all that pavement. Well, Mary's Uncle Proctor would be among the first wave of summer people to begin summering in the East Hamptons, a mere 50-minute train ride from Manhattan. This is the cottage that William Proctor built around 1910. So Mary's 20. She's got access to this cottage her entire life. He and a bunch of Cincinnatians. It wasn't just Cooper. It was a bunch of Cincinnatians. William Rowe, William S. Rowe, president of First National Bank, then the largest bank in Ohio. Richmond Levering, an oil and refining pioneer and Yale man. Joseph Rawson, whose wealth came from the pork industry, and was a Harvard grad, developed what is called today still the Devon Colony in Amagansett. These Cincinnati's built the Devon Yacht Club, and Proctor himself had an 88-foot motor yacht, the Incel. Arguably, it was Cincinnati that made the Hamptons trendy over 100 years ago. Now, disappointingly, over the years, this enclave of a mere 1,000 people lived in Amagansett. That's what the population is still today. It began getting settled. It was settled by Midwesterners, but it would go Hollywood, starting innocently with Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe, and then becoming populated by Hollywood and entertainment riffraff, such as actors and actresses like Scarlett Johansson, Kathleen Turner, Gwyneth Paltrow, Liev Schreiber, Naomi Watts, Alec Baldwin, Robert Downey Jr., Sarah Jessica Parker, and Matthew Broderick. There were also musicians, Paul McCartney, Billy Joel, former presidents, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, comedian Jerry Seinfeld. What's that? Someone wants to know what Jerry Seinfeld's house looks like? That's what Jerry's house looks like. Does that look like Ellen DeGeneres' house? Yeah, I guess it kind of does look like her house. Now, Mary would entertain at the East Hampton home up until she died in 1967. Indeed, she'd come to own it. And I don't know what kind of crazy stuff Mary would have done there. Perhaps she experimented with gateway drugs, like cigarettes. From the what would Mary do with her crowd in New York? Well, her first immersive experience with modern art would have come in the 1913 Armory Show, where paintings by Picasso, George Braque, Paul Cézanne, Henri Matisse, and Vincent van Gogh were making some of their first showings in America. Now, reactions to this show were varied. A majority responded with howls of derision and hostile demonstrations. This is one of the first Van Gogh, or a representation of it. It is a Van Gogh. But Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase was attacked by an angry mob. This art was so outrageous. Henri Matisse was hanged in effigy. Nevertheless, the Armory Show still ranks as one of the most important, or the most important, influential modern art exhibitions ever held in the 20th century. From the United States to a friend in Paris, Mabel Dodge wrote of her enthusiasm for the Armory Show, calling it the most important public event since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. After New York, Mary would go to Paris. She would travel on the Mauretania, the largest man-made mobile structure ever built at that time. It was the fastest ocean liner in the world and the most luxurious. What might have been a topic of conversation? Perhaps the beatification of Joan of Arc, the French national hero by Pope Pius X in 1909. Now that's the same time Mary's arriving in Paris. In Paris, Mary would stay at the Hotel Chatham. This is the hotel. This is where she would dine. Now, you can see those ceilings aren't nearly as ornate as we saw in New York. They're not nearly as high. Those tables are much more crowded. This was Mary's chef at the hotel. This is a famous painting titled Le Chef de la Hotel Chatham, was painted by Sir William Orpen. Now, I've never been to a restaurant that I'm eating at where the chef has been memorialized in a painting that hangs in the Royal Academy of Arts in London or any museum. I point this out because of the rarefied space that Mary was traveling in at an early age. This is Harry's Bar, the most trendy bar of its day. It was located in the same building as Mary's hotel. I wonder who made these travel arrangements. Some high school kid? These are French chemists or scientists. In the United States, we call them bartenders. The story goes that hard-drinking expats or refugees from the Russian Revolution arrived in Paris bringing vodka with them, which was new to France at that time. The bartenders at Harry's found this foreign spirit to be absolutely tasteless. American canned tomato juice, called tomato juice cocktail, was first introduced to them about that time. It was called cocktail because the US was dry at that time. After countless failed experiments, the bartenders finally combined the two and some spices, and voila, the Bloody Mary. Now, I am not absolutely certain, but this might have been Mary having her first Bloody Mary in Paris, in the bar in which the drink was created in the hotel she was staying in. Now, is that a question? Yes. Who else might she have run into in her later travels when she go to Paris at this bar? Well, it would be Bond, James Bond. When Ian Fleming decided upon a favorite bar in Paris for James Bond in the 1960 short story, A View to the Kill, he wrote 007 invariably stuck to the same addresses. If he wanted a solid drink in Paris, he had it at Harry's Bar. The bar below Mary's hotel. In addition to the hipness of that hotel, why would you have stayed at that hotel? I think it was because of its proximity to Palais Garnier, also known as l'Opéra Garnier. L'Opéra Garnier has been called the most famous opera house in the world. And I do mean most famous, because Gaston Leroux's novel, The Phantom of the Opera, was set there. And it was released about the same time Mary was there, 1910. At the opera, Mary would have the opportunity to see groundbreaking musical and ballet performances, like Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov, Rimsky-Korsakov's The Snow Maiden, Igor Stravinsky's The Firebird, Claude Debussy's The Afternoon of a Faun. This is the great Nijinsky, the choreographer. These were radical pieces of dance at that time. They were not broadly and well accepted. This is Afternoon of a Faun. It was called vile, bestial, shamefully erotic. Now, I don't know if I'd really mind if I'm the producer to have that written in the paper, because it might draw more people. In 1913, in a performance of Rite of Spring, written by Stravinsky, also choreographed by Nijinsky, it brought shouts from the audience during the performance. They were so loud. I mean, these are outrageous costumes, that the dancers couldn't hear the orchestra. The choreographer had to run to the wings and count aloud so they were able to keep beat and complete the performance. The set designers for these productions were equally unacceptable. Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, Salvador Dali, George Braque. 3 of the 4 would make it into Mary's collection. Now, who was the friend in Paris that Mabel Dodge was writing to about the New York Armory show? It was Gertrude Stein, the eccentric writer and brilliant conversationalist. It became a legend with a Roman senatorial haircut and lightning quick wit. She also had a phenomenal modern art collection. Her home was a salon for experimental artists, writers, visiting Americans. Among them, Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, George Braque, Juan Gris, again, all in Mary's collection. In her late teens and early 20s, had New York become Mary's second town, and France perhaps her second country. Her uncle's letters to her at the time indicate that she was either in New York or in Amagansett in 1909, 1913, 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917. But where would Mary be found during the horrors of World War I? It was France. And let's go back to her uncle's mantra that with great responsibility, with great wealth comes even greater responsibility. She'd be working as a battlefield nurse for the Red Cross, beginning in 1960, near Nice, France, before the Americans had even entered the war. Between the ages of 20 and 40, Mary would become the epitome of a strong, independent, liberated modern woman. She would study educational theory under Marie Montessori herself, both in New York and in Rome. In her 30s, she would travel to the Philippines to work as a nurse educator, the same Philippines that William Howard Taft would have been the first governor of. The same William Howard Taft would have been on, this is the hospital, this is St. Luke's Hospital. It's, back then, I should show you a slide today. It's the most modern medical center in the Philippines and widely regarded as its best hospital. William Howard Taft would have been on the Imperial cruise in 1905 with Alice Roosevelt and Alice Roosevelt's future husband, Cincinnati Congressman Nicholas Longworth, who would become Speaker of the U.S. House. On this cruise were 29 other members of the House and Senate, their wives, and an array of high-ranking military and civilian officials. It was the Imperial cruise that Robert Kennedy would ask Alice Roosevelt about in the 1960s at a State Department function.
Now, wasn't it absolutely scandalous that you jumped into the ship's swimming pool naked on that cruise?
Her reply, "Dear Bobby, it would have been scandalous if I jumped in with my clothes on." I bring it up because this could have been Mary. She could have lived a life of frivolity, but she chose to live a purposeful life and remain true to her uncle's mantra that with great wealth and privilege comes even greater responsibility. Now let's jump ahead to Act 3, the collector. Mary's in her 40s. Her mother died in 1910. Her uncle died in 1934. Her sister died in 1937. And Mary begins formally studying art again at a 3-year Carnegie painting course that was affiliated with the Cincinnati Art Academy. She studied under the private tutelage of a student of Frank Duvenek's, Carl Zimmerman. Carl would remember Mary for her use of color, which he called bold, distinctive, courageous, modern. This is how I imagine it, reminiscent of the colors that she would have seen from the Fauves when she was in her late teens in Paris and her early 20s. Now let's jump ahead to Mary in her 50s. She would now begin collecting art seriously. In building her collection, she would go in an entirely different direction than Anna Taft's, Mary Emery's, and Mary Hannah's collections, the collections Mary grew up with in Cincinnati. She would outgrow her teenage taste for Domenico Ghirlandaio. There would be no Flemish painters. There would be no Renoirs. There would be no George Romneys in her collection. Mary would be thoroughly modern. Overwhelmingly, her collection was French-centric and on the vanguard of New York art collecting. We don't have time to go over every painting in her 35-piece bequest to the Cincinnati Art Museum, but I'd like to take you through a couple of her illustrations to illustrate her thoroughly modern taste, how she stretched her dollar by negotiating, to learn how she came upon the works, and suggest she was very early in making some of these purchases, acquiring canvases from artists before the oils had even dried, before they were recognized as modern masters, and then explore how might we benchmark her eye against the tastes of her Cincinnati audience and the 20th century art market. This is her first Picasso. It would likely be additive to just about any museum's modern history or modern art collection in the United States. It was only the second or third painting in this style that Picasso did. It was done in 1910. The painting has gone through various names: composition, abstraction, cubist composition. I don't know if you can see up in the back. Finally, still life with glass and lemon. Totally logical, right? Totally logical. Analytical cubism defines a style of cubism that fractures the subject into layers, into multi-dimensions, perhaps even including time, from different views. It's not meant to be easily understood. In 1910, this brought art to almost total abstraction. The viewer was challenged to analyze rather than passively observe or rely on his or her pre-programmed eye that had previously been trained on representational art. Mary Johnston purchased this painting in 1944 to illustrate how cutting edge this was. The much larger Chicago Art Institute did not acquire their first Picasso from this period until 1948, 4 years later. So she's ahead of the wave. Next, Into the Forest with Van Gogh. This is one of the cornerstones of her collection. Undergrowth with Two Figures by Van Gogh. I think it may have been one of her favorite paintings. Why? It's by far probably the most expensive painting that she ever purchased. The canvas was painted northwest of Paris in the same year that Van Gogh died, which, by coincidence, the same year that Mary was born, 1890. She pursued it. She knew her Cincinnati audience. And how do we know that Cincinnati views this as a great painting? Because they voted it numerous times as their favorite painting. So she hit a bullseye with this painting, 70 years later, 60 years later, it's recognized as a favorite painting of the town you're buying it for. I mean, that's some sort of genius or insights. Let's talk a little bit about the art of negotiation. Both of these pieces were owned by the dealer, Jacques Siegelin, who acquired the Van Gogh in 1943. He paid $470,000 for it. He purchased this Picasso earlier. The asking price for the Van Gogh, $940,000. So how did negotiations go? Mary: Jacques, I love the Van Gogh. I'm interested in the Picasso, but I could never afford it at those prices. Gotta go. Jacques: would $750,000 work? Mary: and throw in the Picasso? Perhaps. Mary: oh, Jacques, I'm terribly sorry. The most I could go is $700,000. And that's where the deal got done. She got well over $1 million to $1.2 million of art at a 30% discount. But it was win-win. The dealer made at least 100,000, maybe 230,000. She and Jock had done business. They would continue to do business for the rest of her collecting years. When she died, one of her dealers, Theodore Schempp, was writing the director of the CAM. And he's in Paris. He's trying to arrange his affairs. This opening of Mary's show is delayed multiple times. It doesn't open until 1972. She died in 67. Schempp, I really need to be there at this first opening of her collection. So you gotta tell me when. I mean, get me the invitation, I'll be there. Because she was more like an old friend to me than she was a client. These are the paintings of Georges Rouault. This is probably Mary's favorite artist because there's 6 of these in her collection of 35. That's the most of any artist in her collection. This piece is titled Still Life with Flowers. It was commissioned to serve as a model for a tapestry. The tapestry was never made. Ambrose Villard was his dealer at the time, and Villard would ask for pieces that this is going to be more fun. Would ask for pieces, and then they make prints together of them. So this is how Villard supported himself. He was very. I'm just looking for a battery. No, it has an extra AA in their pocket. This is Clowns by Villard. Villard and Picasso, they had a weird feeling about clowns, and that there's some sort of sympathy, there's some sort of pity, there's some sort of respect. But all these artists became a little bit interested in clowns at that time. Villard's story, or Rouault's story, is that he became fascinated one day watching a clown after work, sitting down, mending his costume, and just, probably in makeup, and it was pathetic to Rouault. This is one of 2 paintings of clowns in Mary's collection. This piece shows a dignified Christ, head erect, yet wearing a crown of thorns. Rouault was a deeply religious man. He challenged himself every day to do the best with God's talents that were bestowed upon him. It was not unusual for him to paint a canvas for 10 years, putting layers upon layers of paint on that canvas before he considered it finished. To some extent, he lived the prototypical tortured life of an artist. All he did was paint. Or make prints. He's just banging on this. It may be similar to Mary's and her uncles constantly challenging themselves to best serve or be the best use to God. It reminds one of the title of Somerset Maugham's novel, The Razor's Edge, and the reference in the book's epigraph to comparing the difficulty of a snail passing along a razor's edge to the difficulty a man of faith has staying loyal and staying on the path to salvation unwaveringly for their life. Art and faith as a struggle. Uniquely, Mary purchased fresh paintings, canvases upon which the oil was still drying. How? Well, here's one example. Somehow, Mary meets Charmian van Wiegen in New York. Charmian is the oddest of odd ducks. She was the daughter of an artist and a German-born war correspondent. She was born in Chinatown in San Francisco yet she lived 4 years in Berlin during her teens. Later, she lived in Moscow from 1929 to 1932. She'd come back to New York and marry a communist activist. She later becomes kind of a New York writer, painter, critic, art collector. Somehow, she hooks up with Mary in her 1950s. I mean, it's just not the typical gal pal from Glendale, or even from the National Cathedral School. Mary buys a couple of paintings directly from her, and I think that they remained lifelong friends. And some evidence of this is that Charmian made the pilgrimage to Cincinnati to attend the opening of Mary's collection in 1972, 5 years after Mary had died. Charmian introduces Mary to Pete Mondrian. Mondrian, that's Charmian, there they are. Now, Mondrian is a bit of a nut. Mondrian was a big fan of swing and jazz and loved dancing all the time, and dancing early on at Charleston, which during its introduction was prohibited in some dance halls around the world for being too outrageous and dangerous. He once told the Dutch press that he would never return to the Netherlands if the Charleston was banned. In September 1938, Mondrian left Paris in the face of advancing fascism. He moved to London. After the Netherlands fell, the Netherlands fell and Paris falls in 1940. He leaves London for Manhattan. There, he becomes obsessed with the music of the day, the boogie woogie. This is him in his apartment and studio. His apartment is painted in 2 colors, white and red. He exhibits this piece in 1941 in New York. It doesn't sell. He takes it back to his apartment. It was called New York 1941, actually, the title of the piece too. He takes it back to his apartment for inspiration, which is only painted in white and red. I did mention he's a bit of a nut. He reworks it, dancing to the boogie woogie, and adds these 2 red stripes. He shows it the following year at another gallery, a show at which Charmian took Mary to. But Mary doesn't buy it. Rather, she makes a discounted offer after the show closes. And she purchases it in March 1942. She bought it for $13,400. The asking price was $17,500. Again, there's this notion of getting value out of every one of her purchases. Now, I honestly have a very hard time thinking I'd go to summer fair and I could reach into my pocket and pay $15,000 for it. I just don't think I could possibly, I couldn't do it. I just could not do it if I saw it. I couldn't do it, guys. One of the most celebrated architects of the 20th century is Philip Johnston, winner of the first Pritzker Architecture Prize. Zaha Hadid also won that Pritzker Prize that designed our Cincinnati Contemporary Art Center downtown. He acquires the first Mondrian in 1941 for the August Museum of Modern Art's collection. Now he's buying it on behalf of them. He's not buying it himself. He's representing the museum in buying this. This is an example of Philip Johnston's architecture. This is exactly Mary's taste in architecture. Their tastes were just right next to each other. So in collecting, she's going toe-to-toe with the most discerning eyes from the most discerning modern art museums in the world. She's absolutely on the bleeding edge, as was Philip Johnston. Now this is a Mondrian. I don't know if you can see this all in the back there, but it was discovered 75 years later, it had been hanging in a museum, and it was discovered that it was hanging upside down. This is how Mary could have ended up. That's Philip Johnston, later years, mugging celebrity with Andy Warhol. We know she had a bullseye with that Van Gogh that we talked about a little bit further, Cincinnati's most popular painting. We also know that the purchase of New York, 1941, 1942, Boogie Woogie was a hit as well. How do we know this was a spectacular purchase? Because some 60 years after its creation, 2004, the painting is sold at auction. It shatters all records for a Mondrian at that time. It sells for $33 million. Sotheby's, 2004. Mary purchased it, $13,400. Mary's collection is very integrated and tied together. A potential starting point for understanding her as a collector and her collection might be look at some of the individual threads of the collection and see if we can figure out how they might be interwoven. Look at each thread, question where it came from, their connectedness and the inherent gravitational pull that might keep this collection to keep this collection together. How is she matching, pairing, rounding out her collection, and integrating with her own life and her own life experience? Let's go through an example. This is the Picasso. We know that Picasso spent plenty of time, 1905 and on, in Paris. Who else was in Paris? Around 1906, Matisse was in Paris. These two meet. They become friends. They're also rivals during their entire careers. Who else is in Paris at that same time? Amedeo Modigliani moves to Paris in 1906. Let's look at it another way. This is Georges Braque. He painted early in the Fauvist style, as had Matisse. Braque was with Picasso near Barcelona when they collaborated on developing analytic cubism. Finally, the subject matter of the Braque and the Picasso are still lives. I believe they're paying homage to Paul Cézanne. It is also in Mary's collection. And where would she have learned all this? Back at the National Cathedral School under Lola Sleeth. And who was in Paris at this time this was happening? It was Mary. Mary was when these guys were first breaking into it. Picasso wasn't Picasso back in those days. Picasso wasn't Picasso until 1934 with Guernica. Well, Mary in Paris, intermittently, had she met him? Had she seen their paintings? Had she gone to Ambrose Villard's gallery? Some of her works came through Villard's gallery, we know, when we check out the provenance. Had she heard about him? Had she read about him? Or was she just chasing this merry band of artists and their art in her later life while remembering her early days in Paris? Remembering her second country, negotiating in French. This is another painting that exhibits another plane of connectedness. This is Marc Chagall's Rooster, a Russian-French Jew who came to the United States from Paris in 1941, as did Piet Mondrian. She purchased the Chagall from Matisse's son, Pierre Matisse, who owned a gallery in New York. She purchased this Matisse in the 40s at the same time Henri Matisse was waiting out World War II, staying in Nice, France, where Mary had worked as a World War I nurse in 1960. We know that she negotiated these purchases. We know the language, of course, of which she could write and speak fluently. At a minimum, there's some personal nature to this collecting, a lot of internal coherence and connectedness. Mary had a very studied and developed eye. She worked at it, she trained that eye. She also got in the back rooms of galleries. She visited painters' studios, and she sometimes bought directly from the artist. And she was confident. When she saw something, she had the skills to close the deal, to buy the artwork. She was a formidable 20th century modern art collector. This was very different than the way Anna Taft, Mary Emery, and Mary Hanna collected. They relied heavily on intermediaries and advisors. They did not really take risks in their collections. Epilogue. Later in her life, Mary dedicated to building her aunts and uncles' legacies for causes that her aunt and uncle believed in. Christ Episcopal Church in Glendale has her uncle's name all over it. The Sisters of Transfiguration Community, Retirement Community, also in Glendale, for Episcopal nuns she bought, has her aunt's name on it. The National Cathedral, the National Church of the Episcopalian Faith, the second tallest church in the United States. Money was given under her aunt's name. This is Jane Proctor Hall, her aunt. It's at the National Cathedral School where Mary went, but it's under her aunt's name. Children's Hospital. Mary was on the board of Children. Her uncle had been on the board, as had his father been on the board at Children's. Alexander Cooper's name is all over Children's Hospital. They gave money and they sent direction. Cincinnati School of Nursing. This was Mary's grand gift to the university. $20 million, named Jane Proctor Hall, not Mary Johnston. The University of Cincinnati, did not know who gave that $20 million till Mary died. This is the Proctor Retreat in Orlandton, Ohio. It was also attached to a rather large farm, 14,000 acres. She loved exploring modern art until the end of her life. In 1966, she's 76, she flies out the curator from the Guggenheim to moderate a talk between modern masters Tim Wesselman, born in Cincinnati, Robert Indiana, love, we all know that from the stamp, and George Siegel, all modern masters in the 60s. And how did she like to do this? Anonymously. So what did we learn? We learned that she was an accidental heiress. She was not a direct lineal heir to the Proctor fortune. She had the good fortune to have great art teachers, but she worked at it. She not only knew art from her textbooks, but she picked up the brush too to understand how these artists created their masterpieces. In her early life, she was in the right places at the right time. This would have allowed her to attend cutting-edge openings and performances that I believe kindled an early interest in the art of the new. She built her collection by relying on her own eye, and she generously gave all of it to the Cincinnati Art Museum. And in the end, Mary and her collection were thoroughly modern. Thank you. Any questions? In the back. The question is the Mondrian, and how was that Mondrian come to be sold in 2004? There's some curious research that I haven't finished on this collection. And there was a little bit of disputes about who actually owned the paintings that she gave to the art museum. So when you've got a painting that's a little bit suspicious perhaps, you can't really loan it out. You can't loan it out. There's a little bit of dispute perhaps. You can put it on your own wall. You can't probably give it. So it was sold by one of the heirs. Now, arguably, it was given to the heirs for this heir for long service as an attorney to her. But that's how that got sold. It was sold for, how much do you think that heir made? Had to sell quick. $340,000. Big deal. Could have hung on to it. $33 million. Another question.
You probably covered it, and I wasn't listening enough. Did the money come from her aunt and uncle? I mean, she had a tremendous lifestyle, traveling, buying. Where did the money come from?
Question is, where did the money come from? That too is a question that deserves a little bit more research, because when her uncle died, he left everything to his wife. His wife lived until 1956. Now at that time, Mary got a chunk of that wealth, but was there some trust that might have been created, or was it just the largesse that this is my hobby, aunt? Can I have another 944,000 to buy a Van Gogh? So I don't know that answer, and it's not clear when you look at that. It's an excellent question. Please.
What drove you to do this talk and research on this woman? Because I worked in the museums for years, and I know the other three, never heard of this woman.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how that drove you, unless you're a Glendale native.
I'm from Wisconsin. From the University of Wisconsin. Yeah, Cheesehead, thank you. So I was one of those lucky kids that had a good art appreciation teacher. And his name was Arnie Alanese. He's still alive, Arnold Alanese. Arnie also went to the University of Wisconsin before me. BFA in art and an MFA in printmaking. Arnie was at my high school teaching. He was, making the break between being an artist and being an art teacher. He loved to drive a Cadillac to school. And he'd ask about it, he'd say, the reason I did that was just to show kids that you can make a living as an artist. Arnie got his big break when he gave one of his prints to the local PBS auction. His career took off from there. He left teaching, became a full-time artist. Odd is the oddest thing. I can't imagine anyone else having the experience. One of his originals is in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Just baffling, just odd. So I was that lucky kid that had a good art teacher. So, and again, my wife is a great inspiration about getting out of the house.